Well, we are continuing our study. We're up to lesson number 8, but tonight we're going to be doing 2 of the commandments. Do not steal and do not give false testimony. We'll be covering 2 of those, and we'll the next week we'll study the 10th commandment, do not covet. We might take a little extra time on that one as well. So let's just jump right in with our outlines there that are available at the link if you're watching online, and available in person here in the Fireside Room if you come into the church. Let's just begin. We'll begin with a little bit of review of where we've been so far, and I won't linger on these because we've hit these several times here. Okay, so the commandments we've looked at so far. Commandment number 1, you shall have no other gods before me. And this is as far as importance, God is preeminent over all, and we worship the one true God, we worship one God, and we worship only one God. And so then that brings us to the second commandment. These first 2 commandments overlap quite a bit here, because along with that second commandment, there shall be no graven images or idols. Don't make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven, above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. So the idea is that God accepts no substitutes. We don't substitute anything for God. Third commandment, reviewing again here, do not misuse God's name. And I'll read there from Exodus 27. You shall not misuse or take in vain the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. And so that idea of just taking in vain or making it useless, being flippant with God's name, we're not to do that. The next command is remember the Sabbath. And again, we've mentioned this several times, that all of the commandments are reiterated in the New Testament specifically for Christians to obey, except for the 4th commandment, which is remember the Sabbath. And what that means is that we do not set apart, we're not commanded as Christians in this age to set apart the 7th day, which is Saturday, to worship. There's nothing wrong with worshiping God on every day of the week, but we don't set apart that day in that special way as was done in the Old Testament. However, the pattern of the New Testament was to set apart the 7th day of the week because it commemorated the resurrection of Jesus. That was the pattern of the early church. We follow that pattern today. And also, there is a principle behind the Sabbath, and that is we need to have times where we pause and remember God. And we get our priorities straight, and we get rid of all distractions. And there's a principle, a Sabbath principle behind that, that is good for us to remember. And also, Jesus is known as our Sabbath rest in that sense. So that brings us to the 5th commandment. Honor your father and mother. And that's a very simple one. The cornerstone of society is the family. And part of that command was honor your father and mother so that you may live long in the land I am giving you. God is saying, if you want to have a good society, a healthy society that lasts long, you need to have healthy families. And the cornerstone of healthy families is respect. Honor your father and mother. The 6th commandment, you shall not murder. And from this, reviewing that, we remember that human life is set apart from the rest of creation. We are created in the image of God. We are also reminded that human life has intrinsic value of itself. And then that we also understand that God is sovereign over all human life, and that only God is sovereign over all human life. Now, last week we talked about the 7th commandment. You shall not commit adultery. Exodus 20, verse 14. Now, there are several different types of adultery that we talked about. There's the physical adultery, in other words, cheating on your spouse, being unfaithful to your marriage vows. Everybody's familiar with that. But then Jesus, oftentimes in the New Testament, would take these commands and he would get to the heart of the matter. And so he talked about, okay, you've heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery, but I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. There's adultery of the heart. And again, that's the idea of allowing your thoughts to be overwhelmed with lust, or in guarding your heart. And then there's the idea of spiritual adultery. That is, having an undue fondness for the things that are opposed to God. And so Jeremiah 3:20, this is the prophet of the Old Testament. He says, but like a woman unfaithful to her husband, so you, Israel, have been unfaithful to me, declares the Lord. So God was to be worshipped above all things. They worshipped idols. God said that's no different than a spouse cheating on than a husband cheating on their wife, or a wife cheating on her husband. That's what you have done to me. And so the conclusion here we have from this is that, first of all, three conclusions we had. Marriage is God's idea. We are to treat it with respect, and you disrespect marriage when you seek affection outside of the marriage. When God prohibits something, he does it to provide for us and protect us. And so God wants the best for our lives, and so he wants us to understand what healthy relationships are. And so healthy relationships are faithful relationships. And so when we experience that, he is providing the best for us, but also he is protecting us. And we have all seen examples, and sadly, of when people go outside of their marriage and the pain that comes about from that and the heartache. Now, that being said, God can forgive this sin, and God can bring healing, and God can bring restoration from this, but God wants to protect us from that pain. And then a last one would just simply be, always be on guard. Never think that you're ever above, or that would never be something that could happen in your life. You must always be on guard. I tell you, the devil is sneaky, and he will try anything he can to enter into your life to destroy yourself, destroy your relationships. The enemy comes to steal, kill, and destroy, and he will do anything he can. So always be on your guard. So tonight we're going to cover two commandments. We're going to cover the 8th commandment, which is, first of all, you shall not steal. So that is Exodus 20 and verse 15. And so this is a very simple command, but I think there's some things that we can gain from this, some other insights in here. Now, I want to also just make it real clear. I've said this before in different studies and things, but whenever I put these studies together, I draw from a multitude of sources. I've been leaning heavily on, there's a website called gotquestions.org, and they're really good about, you can just type in a question, a Bible question, and they're really solid. Most of the time, I'll pretty much agree. And so a lot of this material here is just giving credit where credit is due, because I don't want to be stealing, so I wanted to make sure I did that. But a lot of this comes from gotquestions.org. So definition of stealing here, we'll just use this as a definition here. Taking another person's property without their permission. All right? So here's something that this implies, that I hadn't thought about it this way. God endorses the idea of property ownership. So there are those that say, well, if you live by faith, you really don't. It really shouldn't own property, or some people kind of get these different philosophies and of that we shouldn't really own property, that everything just belongs to God. But this implies that yes, property ownership is something that is endorsed by God, with the understanding that we really don't own anything. We are all stewards of what God gives to us in this life, and we are stewards of that. As Psalm 24:1 says, "The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it." So we see here that God does endorse the idea of property ownership. Also, we'll see here that in some cases here, God allowed for the use of lethal force for people to protect their property. Over in Exodus 22, verses 2 and 3. "If a thief is caught breaking in at night and is struck a fatal blow, the defender is not guilty of bloodshed. But if it happens after sunrise, the defender is guilty of bloodshed." Now, I'm not sure about the sunrise or not, but I don't have an answer for that of what's the difference between sunrise or not, but it's probably because you'd be assuming more of a danger at night. But we see here God is allowing for property ownership and the defending of one's property of this. And I think the idea of at night, it brings with it more danger, somebody coming in, and so you're protecting your family, not just your property there. And the dark is evil, right? Exactly. So, what are some different types of stealing that you might find in the Bible? Now, the commandment, "You shall not steal," it's interesting, it does not have any qualifiers, as listed in Exodus chapter 20. So it just says, it doesn't say "you shall not steal unless you're hungry," or "you shall not steal." It just says "you shall not steal," but there's some more specifics added later on as to what things you aren't to steal. And of course, this is, so here's some different types of stealing. One thing that goes on, the stealing of a person. Now, this would go under kidnapping, but really what we're talking about here is slavery, is the slave trade, as we would have seen in our country's history and in England's history and in many different countries that did that back, a century and a half ago. But some people think that, well, the Bible doesn't condemn that type of thing, or the Bible doesn't condemn slavery. Well, Exodus chapter 21 and verse 16. "Anyone who kidnaps someone is to be put to death, whether the victim has been sold or is still in the kidnapper's possession." This is against the slave trade. This is what this is about. It's because it is stealing a person. The Bible clearly condemns that slave trade as we would understand in our common history. The stealing of animals. Exodus 22 verse 1. "Whoever steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it must pay back 5 head of cattle for the ox and the 4 sheep and 4 sheep for the sheep." So there was paying back. There was the punishment that went along with this. I mean, the animals, that was part of their livelihood. They weren't just pets. Have that. He was my buddy. He was my friend. He was my breakfast every now and then. You're one of the animals there, but but stealing of animals, that was part of their livelihood back in the day. So now another part of stealing this, and this might even sound familiar in modern times, defrauding people. I think of Bernie Madoff. He made off with a lot, didn't he? And Leviticus 2 through 7. "If anyone sins and is unfaithful to the Lord by deceiving a neighbor about something entrusted to them or left in their care, or about something stolen." So this is the old idea of defrauding somebody. "Or if they cheat their neighbor, or if they find lost property and lie about it, or if they swear falsely about any such sin that people may commit. When they sin in any of these ways and realize their guilt, they must return what they have stolen or taken by extortion, or what was entrusted to them, or the lost property they found, or whatever it was they swore falsely about. They must make restitution in full, add 1/5 of the value to it, and give it all to the owner on the day they present their guilt offering. So this is the idea. If you swindle somebody, you got to pay that back, and you're going to pay it back with interest. And so that's under the heading of stealing here. And then also under the heading of stealing would be, let me just put this on there. Let me read that, Proverbs 20:23. The Lord detests differing weights, and dishonest scales do not please him. There's defrauding, that's stealing. So then the other one would be withholding due wages. So this is for the employer. You have Leviticus 19:13. Do not defraud or rob your neighbor. Do not hold back the wages of a hired worker overnight. So in this case, you're stealing somebody's time, you're stealing somebody's effort, their work. Now you can flip this as well for the employee, that you don't want to steal time from your employer. You know, you're given a job to do and maybe a certain amount of time to do it in, and so we are to honor that and the best we can in whatever our jobs are, to work with diligence and to work with our hands in that way. So there's one more of area of stealing that you could put in here, and we call it withholding one's offering from God. Many of you would have heard this passage before, and this is the idea. First of all, let me just make this clear when it comes to talking about giving. I'll let you in on a secret. We preachers, we don't like to talk about giving. That's one of our least favorite things we want to talk about, is get up and talk about, hey, send your money in, and and so that's just not our thing. But I will say this: God does not need our possessions. We are the ones that need to give them to God. It's an act of worship. It's what this is about. Jesus said, where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. So when we have some skin in the game and we give some of our treasure in offering to God, that is where our hearts are going to be. But let me read to you from Malachi chapter 3, verses 8 through 10. Now this was in a time in Israel's history where people were being a little lax in their giving, and they were not giving as they were supposed to or they were commanded to. And Malachi writes these words: will a mere mortal rob God? Yet you rob me. But you ask, how are we robbing you? In tithes and offerings. You are under a curse, your whole nation, because you are robbing me. Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. Test me in this, says the Lord Almighty, and see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that there will not be enough room to store it. So that's the idea of when we know that we are to give to God, and our tithe or offering or whatever it might be, and we fail to do that. In essence, in Malachi there, that is referred to as robbing God. So there's some different types of stealing, and why this commandment is needed. It seems like it would be obvious. Don't take my stuff, okay? It seems like it would be obvious. But let's talk about what's the problem behind the problem. The problem behind the problem, the problem behind the problem of stealing, is greed. Jesus said in Luke 12:15, watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in abundance of possession. And if you give in to greed, greed could lead to stealing. It could lead to other sins as well. And then in Matthew 6:19 through 21, I mentioned this earlier, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy, and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So the whole idea is when we give in our treasure, when our treasure is invested in the things of God, our heart will be closer to the things of God. And so, If you think about that, if you go to a racetrack, or if you've seen somebody at a racetrack and they put down a bunch of money on a horse during that race, where is their heart? Their heart is following that horse. They want to see. If you're investing and you're putting your earthly treasure into the kingdom of God, that's where your heart's going to be. Let's move on here. What is the cure for stealing? Well, just simply stop stealing. Well, no, I'm going to make it that simple. Here's in the book of Ephesians, chapter 4, and I put this verse on the screen here as well. This is an example here where it's a 10 Commandment, and it's reiterated for Christians in the New Testament. So Ephesians 4:28, anyone who has been stealing must steal no longer, but must work doing something useful with their own hands, that they may have something to share with those in need. So, here's this little verse here gives a threefold cure for stealing. Okay, the first part of the cure is honesty. Steal no longer. Determine in your heart, I'm not going to take anything else. Steal no longer. The other part of this is industry. Work with your own hands. I have a lot of respect for people that just work hard, and because if you're working, then you don't have time and energy to put into stealing or figuring out how to cheat somebody. So industry, work with your own hands, and then that's for the purpose of so that you can share with those who are in need. It used to be, when I was a young guy, when I was a kid, I used to dream about what it would be like if I was a multimillionaire. If all of a sudden, I came into a bunch of money, what would I do with that? And I used to think, I'd buy all these cars. Well, I'd buy all these guitars, and I would buy all this stuff that would be something that I would enjoy, and I would think of all this list of stuff. But now I don't think in terms of that anymore. I think of, boy, I could bless such and such, or I could do. I always kind of my secret thing. I would love to just secretly come into a whole bunch of money where nobody knew about it, and you could just secretly do a bunch of things like that. What a blessing that would be, and because that's the idea. You earn your money. And yes, you earn it, and it's your property in a sense, but you're a steward of that. Being a steward of that means you use that, the blessing that you've been given, to be a blessing to others, to share with those who are in need. So, that is the do not steal. That brings us to the 9th commandment. You shall not give false testimony. Verse 20, chapter 20 and verse 16. I'll read the whole verse. You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. So let's break down what this verse is talking about here. This goes beyond just lying in that sense. So first of all, to give false testimony, that is to lie about another person for the purpose of either causing them pain or for your own personal gain. So do not give false testimony against your neighbor. And then who is your neighbor? Anyone with whom you come in contact. So that's family, friends, so that's the idea. So do not lie about any other person for your own personal gain. So that's giving a false testimony. And the gain could be for money, or the gain could be for reputation, or the gain could be that somebody's impressed with what you know, or something like that. And so looking at this closer, I see a little different perspective on what this command is specifically about. But that being said, the Bible does address the whole subject of just honesty and deceit very clearly. So right here, do not give false testimony. Again, it is about honesty, but it's about not mistreating those who are around you or speaking falsely about them. So This next passage here expands on the 9th commandment here. This is Exodus 23, 1 through 2. As we talk about, don't give false testimony against your neighbor. Let me read you here. Exodus 23, beginning in verse 1. It's 1 through 3, actually. Do not spread false reports. You see where this is going here? Do not help a guilty person by being a malicious witness. Do not follow the crowd in doing wrong. When you give testimony in a lawsuit, do not pervert justice by siding with the crowd. Now let me ask you something. Can you think of a time in the Bible where justice was perverted and false reports were spread about somebody? You can think of the time when Jesus was put on trial. He went through 6 different trials, and false witnesses were brought about. And what did it end up in? It ended up in being sent to the cross. When you give testimony in a lawsuit, do not pervert justice by siding with the crowd. Isn't that interesting? That he was falsely accused, and because of that, he was sent to the cross. And so really the sin of that whole crowd was giving false testimony. That's what that was. So a couple of points here on your outline there if you want to fill this in. Bearing false witness or giving a false witness, first of all, goes against God's nature. We are to be imitators of God and His character. And when we give false testimony, that goes against His nature. Numbers 23 and verse 19. God is not human that He should lie, not a human being that He should change His mind. Does He speak and then not act? Does He promise and not fulfill? So here we see here is that God never lies. He is the God of truth. And when we bear false witness, when we lie, when we deceive, we are going against the nature of God. And then repeating this theme we've talked about before, bearing false witness is harmful to others. And a lot of times when people are speaking, giving a false testimony about somebody, it's because of revenge or because they don't like somebody. Leviticus 19 and verse 18. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. You remember when Jesus was asked, what's the most important command? Love the Lord your God. Love your neighbor as yourself. It's right here. Part of that is how you speak about your neighbor. And now there is a very, very powerful passage in the book of Proverbs, chapter 6, verses 16 through 19. Again, this is written in poetic form. So the way that you read this, it's a Hebrew poem that is written poetic form to make the point. There are 6 things the Lord hates, 7 that are detestable to Him: haughty eyes, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked schemes, feet that are quick to rush into evil, a false witness who pours out lies, and a person who stirs up conflict in the community. Boy, that's a powerful one, isn't it? And I don't know about you, there's not much. I'm pretty easygoing, but if I'm aware that somebody's just trying to stir up conflict or just always make trouble or stir the pot, I have to be honest. Those are the people that I just steer clear of. So you go swimming in your own pool, have your fun over there doing your thing. I don't want it. I don't want any part of that. And then sometimes somebody will be strong enough, or they're doing that where you just kind of have to confront that and say you can't do that, And but because it is harmful, bearing false witness. It stirs up conflict and wicked schemes, those types of things, pouring out lies, and people have all kind of motives for doing those types of things. But God, very, very, in very strong terms, He goes against that, and haughty eyes. I think it's just having about pride, being prideful, looking. That's the question was asked. What are the haughty eyes? That's prideful, looking down on others. So there's the idea. Now, this brings a question, though. People are going to come up. Is it ever right to lie? Is it ever right to lie? So this is, I kind of got some of this from that Got Questions. I kind of looked at it because I thought they had a good take on it here. First of all, obviously, the Bible is full of passages that speak very negatively about not lying. The Bible is not pro-lying, okay? So Psalm 119:29, keep me from deceitful ways and be gracious to me and teach me your law. Psalm 120, verse 2, save me, Lord, from lying lips and from deceitful tongues. Proverbs 12:22, the Lord detests lying lips, but he delights in people who are trustworthy. Being trustworthy, being a person of your word. So the Bible is full of passages that condemn lying and being deceitful. However, I think there are two instances in the Bible where a person telling a lie seemed to produce a favorable result. And so we'll look at those two instances here, and we'll make some conclusions here. The first example are the Hebrew midwives that were protecting the Hebrew babies. This takes you back to the book of Exodus. The Jewish people are in slavery, and Pharaoh makes this command that all the Hebrew babies, if it's a boy, that the baby is to be killed. Well, the Hebrew midwives just were a little deceitful, or they said that the Hebrew women were vigorous and they gave birth before they arrived, and so they weren't able to put the baby to death. And so so I'll just read from Exodus 1:19. The midwives answered Pharaoh, Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women, so they are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive. So that was not a truth. They really weren't telling, they were just trying to protect these babies. And you'll notice in verse 20, the next verse, it says, and God was kind to the midwives. So in this case, they were not technically telling the truth. What they were doing, they were protecting these babies. So there's another instance where some deception was given or some lies were told, and it turned out into a favorable result, and that would be Rahab. This was over in the book of Joshua. So the Israelites were getting ready to make their way into Canaan, and and God told them to send some spies over into Jericho and to scope it out. And so some spies went over there, some Hebrew spies, and they were protected by Rahab while they were there. Some of the officials were looking for the Hebrew spies, and when she made a deal, Rahab made a deal with him. You protect me and my family, and I'll protect you. And they made this deal, so the Hebrew spies, they escaped, and people of Jericho were looking for them. And here's Rahab in Joshua 2:5. She tells this lie. I don't know which way they went. Go after them quickly. You may catch up with them. So she's misdirecting them. But she and her family were blessed for protecting these spies. As a matter of fact, you'll find the name Rahab in the genealogy of Jesus. So isn't that interesting to find that? So I'm going to just read a quote here from the Got Questions website. And here's the quote about this. The Bible nowhere states that there are instances where lying is the right thing to do. It doesn't outright say, now it's okay to lie in this case here. You don't get that. At the same time, the Bible does not declare that there is no possible instance where lying is an acceptable option, such as these that we've seen here. So I know it's not like the clearest answer in the world there, but is it ever right to lie? You can see these examples here in these cases where they were protecting people in that sense. However, we need to be understanding that, the old devil can help us rationalize a lot of things. And we can rationalize not telling the truth when we really should tell the truth. And these are extreme examples here. So we'll come down to the conclusion, and two simple conclusions here. First of all, is that God is always on the side of truth. Jesus said, "You shall know the truth, and the truth will set you free." And Colossians 3:9-10, "Do not lie to each other, since you have taken off your old self with its practices, and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge in the image of its creator." So again, as we grow in our faith, our capacity to speak the truth and to be authentic in our conversations and our actions should be growing at all times. God is always on the side of the truth, and when we speak the truth, we are reflecting the character of God. We're also given the command to speak the truth in love. Sometimes I hear people say, "Well, I like to be brutally honest." I think what they like to say, I like to be brutal. So speak the truth in love. And then, simple to that, or companion to that, the enemy is on the side of deception. You think about this, from the very beginning, the first thing the devil, from the very first statement we read of his, he is planting seeds of deception. Remember the first statement of the serpent. Did God really say? Now, that was a question. It wasn't necessarily a lie, but it was planting a seed of deception. Did God really say? And then he twisted God. Did God really say you can't eat from any of these trees in the whole garden? And so that was obviously a twisting of the truth, distortion of the truth. And here is what the Lord has to say about the devil. Now, he is speaking, of all things, he's speaking to religious leaders. Okay, this is John 8:44. I can't imagine standing up in front of some religious leaders and saying this, but Jesus is Lord, and it's what he did. He said, "You belong to your father, the devil." Wow, that's a good way to win a crowd over, isn't it? "And you want to carry out your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning, not holding to the truth, for there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks his native language, for he is a liar and the father of lies." When we live in the truth, we are reflecting the character of God. When we give over to deception and into lies, then we are getting into the character of the enemy and giving into his ways there. So that is lesson 8. Do not steal, do not lie, commandments 8 and 9. And the next time we get together, we will talk about commandment number 10. But that's only 9 lessons. We're going to have one more lesson after that to make a summary of everything. So there will be 10 lessons, but even though we'll finish the 10th commandment the next time we meet together, we will have an extra lesson after that that's going to combine a few things together.